Hi, my name is Joe Wheat, and I am going for the 96 to 100% bracket on this project. My project is based off of a repeatable process that I do at work every single day. Without further ado, let's get into the details of how my bot works and how this process works. So each day at work, we process invoices and we send them over. I work at BYU Broadcasting in the accounting department, by the way. And so we'll process invoices and we'll send them over to campus for payment. And when we send them over to campus, we'll put them on this invoice tracker. And so what the invoice tracker consists of is all the information that you found on an invoice: the vendor name, our purchase order number, our amounts, invoice number, and so on and so forth. So we send those over to campus, and each day campus will send us what's called an AP accrual report in an email shown here, where we'll get the files that basically says, this is an example of what they would send us, and it basically says, here are the invoices we received yesterday, and here's the information that's on it, just letting you know we got it and it's being paid. And so what we do every single day is we'll go through and compare this, get this purchase order ID and this invoice ID, and compare it to what's on the invoice tracker. And if they match, then we'll fill in this column right here with the date of the accrual report, so it's which is found right here. So it's marked as paid. This process is kind of tedious and monotonous, and sometimes take a little bit more time than it should. And so UiPath RPA would be a perfect resource to use for this kind of project. And so what my robot does is it does that entire process for me. So first it goes into my Outlook and picks up everything from this AP accruals folder and saves those into an emails variable. Then it will go in and save the attachments into this specific AP report folder, which is found here. As you can see, it's empty. It filters, since we get two different types of attachments, one a PDF and one an Excel file. I don't want to save both because that would result in a very cluttered file. And so I filtered it to make sure it's only XLX documents, because those are easier to read than PDFs. I go back to the flowchart, and then it'll pop up. Then an input dialog box will pop up, and basically says, enter the file, enter the AP report that you want. And so you'll go to this work folder where the AP report will be saved. You copy and paste the name into this input dialog box, and it turns it into an AP report variable. Following this, it'll open up my invoice tracker found here and my accrual report found here, and create a data table for both of those. And it'll count the number of rows in those data tables so I can do while loops later a little bit more efficiently. So I have a try-catch loop right here. I'll explain in a little bit more detail what that does, but just so you see the overall thing. It'll go through, get the AP report, create a data table that we can use later on. After this process is done, then the real work begins. So it'll go into the AP report, and there's an AP row counter that starts at 8 because the data starts at 8 on the 8th row. And it will go through and create variables for each of our necessary inputs. So it'll go in, get the report date from this cell right here, and then it will go in and create a variable for the PO number from this cell and the invoice ID from this cell. And so what it's designed to do is each time it goes through this, it'll go for each row. The issue is that if you just put it as that, we're going to get some null values here. And that's fine, but what it'll do is it'll collect this null value and compare those null values to everything that's on this invoice tracker. And that takes absolutely forever. Just imagine going through 81 lines of data and then 40-something lines of data on the other side each time. So that takes forever. So what I did is I added this do while loop that basically says if the PR number is null, then we just go on to the next row, and it will do that as long as there are rows in that table. Then once those variables on the AP report are saved, then it'll go in and do the same thing for the invoice tracker. So it'll go in, collect the PO number from this line and the invoice number from this line, and save those as variables. And then it will compare them via an if statement. And if the PR numbers match and if the invoice numbers match, then it will go to fill in that cell. And so then it goes, reads the paid date. If it's empty, then it'll fill it in with the AP report date as we showed earlier, and if not, then it won't do anything. And then we go to the next row in the row counter, and so on and so forth until the process is done. Then we get a nice little message box at the end here that basically says, you're all done. So let's, without further ado, let's run through this so you get a little bit of an impression of what my robot does. So let's make sure everything is out here that needs to be. For simplicity's sake, we're not going to use an AP accrual report that has 80 lines of data. We're going to use a smaller one that gives you the same effect. So we're going to use the one that we got on December 8th. So let's run it and see what happens. So it pops up with this dialog box. So we go into our work folder, we see that it saved the attachment that we need. And we go in, make sure we include XLSX so it can read the file properly. We're going to copy and paste in here. Hit OK. Then let's look at the invoice tracker and see what it's doing. So it's opening up the AP accrual report, collecting variables, then running through each line of data. Found a match. Found another match. And found one last match. And just finish the table. And we're all done. So click OK here. And so let's go through and make sure that that worked. So let's go, we'll open this. We'll run a split screen so we can get a good visual. Okay. So what it did is for each line of data that has a PO number, it compared it to each line in this invoice tracker. So you'll notice that this BH Photo and Electronics group doesn't have a match. Even though it has a PO number, that invoice is not on our invoice tracker. And basically what that means is it was from another employee processed it who doesn't have access to our invoice tracker. That happens quite often. He has his own system of tracking, so we're not too concerned about this. But let's go through and make sure that everything that is on the invoice tracker was included. So the first one we see is this Pure Energy Sports, has this PO and this invoice number. We see it here, same PO, same invoice number, and filled in that cell right there. Then we have, oh, whoops, sorry, wrong cell. And it filled in this cell right here. Then we have Pepper Producciones, which has a couple different lines, but these lines are just made up of 2 different invoices. And we can see those invoices right here with the matching PO numbers, and those paid dates were filled in. And there's no more. So we can see that the bot adequately went through all lines of data, collected everything that we need, and got all the relevant values and filled it in for us. And it went a lot faster than what would have been done manually. Okay, so let's look at this try-catch loop. So as I said before, one of the common errors that we'd run into is someone inputting a wrong file name. This can be very common if they just decide to type in the file name rather than collecting it, or rather than just copying and pasting it. And so so it'll flash an error sign if that's the case, that the file that we selected does not exist. And so that's the try portion, and then it'll go into this catch portion. So whenever we type in a different name than what's in our file, it'll create a new spreadsheet. We don't want this. We don't want the bad spreadsheet in our save folder. So what this does is it'll go through, delete that folder. I'll show you how that works in a second, and it'll pop up a new dialog box that says, whoops, you entered the wrong name. Try copying and pasting, insert that in the dialog box, and it just runs it over again. So let's do this process one more time, just to make sure that we got everything that we needed to. We'll erase these. Save the file. Let's close this, and we'll delete this so it can redo it, and let's run it. Okay, so it pops up with this dialog box, and we see that it added our accrual reports to this folder. So let's just say that someone decided that they didn't want to copy and paste it, they just wanted to type it out, and they did it wrong. So for simplicity's sake, we'll just type in some random characters .xlsx. Make sure I did that right. Okay. Hit OK. And it creates that new file that we don't want. And since that file is void, it can't read it. There's nothing in that to collect variables from, and so it pops up with this dialog box that says, whoops, you didn't enter the right file name. Try again. So then you go and you copy this, plug it in here, hit run, and it'll loop through that process once more. And so while that's running, just to show you, so basically what the try catch loop does is you try and insert the wrong name. It catches, it flashes up an error that says, hey, this isn't a valid name. So instead of flashing up that error sign and stopping the workflow, it just goes in, deletes that file, and pops up with a new dialog box that says, input dialog box says try again, and it'll just run the process once more. So let's check on it. Almost done, all done, perfect. So the bot works, it does everything I need it to do, in much less time than I would otherwise do manually. So the reason I feel like I deserve, if that's the right word, a 96 to 100 is this. So the thing that I did that I feel like was unique, that we didn't do in the scope of the class, was this email portion. That was something that there was a couple videos on it, but it was still kind of tricky for me, and so that was something where I had to demonstrate learning on my own to go in and figure out, okay, how do we go into emails, how do we access, for example, like this special folder, how do we get it from this special folder only instead of the inbox, how do we save one portion of the attachment rather than both, so on and so forth. But I guess the real reason I feel like I went above and beyond the scope of the project is this. This was my original flowchart. For the last week, this is what I worked on. I probably spent 12 to 15 hours creating this, and as you can see, it's an absolute mess. It does all the same things. It's exactly the same functionality of what I did on the other flowchart. It's just not as clean. It wasn't quite as effective, and so after spending hours and hours and hours on this, even though it worked, I decided, you know what, this isn't going to cut it. Just getting it done isn't going to do it. I need it to be understandable for the user. And so at around 3 in the morning, sorry for the sob story, but around 3 in the morning, I decided, you know what, there's got to be a better way to do this. So I researched it and turned it into this, which is a much neater flowchart. Overall, I probably spent between 20 and probably around 25 to 30 hours on this project, which I'll be honest is probably longer than what most people did. I don't know what the averages are. I don't know how long my fellow classmates spent on this project, but I know that the kind of work that I put in was above and beyond the call to just create a simple flow chart that just does a basic process. I decided to go for something that was a little bit more complex, with multiple if statements, with email attachments, with going through multiple lines of data on different spreadsheets, and having the bot make decisions for me. But I appreciate you sitting through and listening to me ramble on about my project. I appreciate you taking the time to grade it, especially on Christmas break. But I just want to say thank you so much for the wonderful semester that we had, and I hope you have a Merry Christmas.